I believe Russia's collapse is inevitable. In this video, I'm going to present to you 4 arguments supporting this bold statement.
Aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
My first argument is the strongest one. Russia is an empire, and just like any empire, sooner or later it is bound to collapse. And while this sounds good, you may argue, wait a minute, but Russia is not an empire, it's a federative republic, which is true. On the surface, in constitution, Russia is a federative republic, but it's evident that with a dictator in power, Russia is anything but a republic. In fact, Russia strongly exhibits 6 characteristics of being an empire. I have made a 2-part video where I go in detail proving that modern-day Russia is an empire, so please check them out. But here I'll quickly skim through those attributes and tell you what they are. The first essential attribute of any empire is expansionism, meaning empires constantly try to expand their territorial boundaries. With Russian recent annexation of Ukrainian territories, we can clearly see this applies to Russia. Over the course of their history, Muscovy has been expanding at a rate on average 1 Belgium per year. Expansionism is at the core of Muscovy's existence, and this very core is very well alive today and hungry for more conquests. Second attribute of an empire is centralization, basically meaning every empire must have an emperor who has all the power centralized in one's hands. It's very evident that all the power in Russia is centralized in the hands of one man who has been in power for a quarter of a century now. Not every emperor in history can boast with that long-standing rule. Third characteristic of an empire is diversity. One cannot have an empire with just one ethnic group within it. This would be just one big country. Well, Russia has 190 different ethnic groups and over 100 languages spoken, which clearly proves that it matches this attribute as well. The fourth attribute is control, meaning empires will seek to control others by all means possible. Force, diplomacy, bribes, economical dominance, espionage, blackmail, etc. And we see how Russia is not shying away from any of those methods to exert its control. It is using force in Ukraine right now. It used force in many countries of Africa, in Syria, in Georgia, in Moldova, in Chechnya, and that's just for the last 30 years. Russia routinely meddles in the affairs of EU and United States by bribing politicians, by blackmailing with natural gas, by weaponizing illegal immigration, by manipulating social medias, by using cyber warfare, by running propaganda channels, by operating an internet troll farm specifically made to control the narrative. For more details, please watch my video How Russia Meddles in the Affairs of Others. The fifth attribute, imperialism. It's a sophisticated word which basically means exploitation of captured colonies. If we look through the historical lens on Muscovy Kingdom, we'll notice that there has always been a wealthy center like Moscow and St. Petersburg later built, and then we'll notice an awful poverty in the peripheries as a result of exploitation. Today, over 12 million Russians live without running water in their homes. Over 20 million Russians live for less than $150 a month. Over 30 million Russians don't have sewage in their homes. And that's all while Russia is being the most wealthiest country on Earth in terms of natural resources. So where do the trillion-dollar profits of selling those resources go? And they clearly don't end up in places where they were extracted from. For one person who died in this war in Moscow, 60 died in Buryatia. Again, all the interesting details about imperialism in my video How Russia is Exploiting Its Territories. And the sixth, final characteristic of an empire is legacy. Russian Empire is not leaving coliseums, aqueducts or scientific breakthroughs behind itself. It's leaving corruption and lies. That is Russian legacy. I know this sounds ridiculous and you might dismiss me and claim I'm biased. And while yes, I am biased, but do you ever know a case where Russia was on the side of freedom? Where Russia was on the side of democracy, human rights? Do you ever know a case where Russia did something good without wanting anything in return? No, not a single case. And most scientific achievements that could have potentially been attributed to Russian legacy, most of them either have been appropriated from the works of scientists from other nationalities like the space program, or point-blank stolen, like the nuclear program. I have a video about that as well. You can find out what Russia has appropriated or stolen in much more detail there. Where Russia used to be, we see a lot of brainwashed people who believed Russia's lies. And we see corruption literally fading away the further one gets away from Russia. The corruption that is seeping into even international organization that Russia is present in. And this legacy that Russia is leaving behind is just one more reason for it to stop existing, along with its corruption and lies. I will give you an interesting example from the history. In 1839, a French author has visited Russia and wrote this in his book, quote, "The nature of the Russian government is interference, negligence, and corruption." Since then, nothing has changed. However, since then, Russian Empire has collapsed twice already. They say third time is the charm, right? First time it collapsed in 1917 due to economical decline and the First World War they have entered, but couldn't win. After that, Russia has regrouped and managed to reclaim most of its lost colonies, rebranded itself as USSR, just to collapse again 74 years later. And again, due to economical decline and the war they have started in Afghanistan but couldn't win. Third time they're going to collapse exactly the same way, due to economic deterioration and the war they have started but cannot win. Their economy has already been stagnating since 2014, and now after invading Ukraine, it started to deteriorate. Now it's a question of time when it will decline enough to a point where Russian government cannot pay salaries to the police guarding the regime from the hungry people. We can already spot the deterioration signs by looking at the condition of the army that has been exposed to us thanks to this war. Instead of newly developed Armata tanks that are being paraded on the Red Square each year, we see Russia putting outdated T-55 tanks into the battle. Instead of professional and well-equipped troops, we see looters and literally convicts dressed haphazardly in whatever, equipped with gear of questionable quality. This very same corruption that we see in the military has seeped through all of the empire's branches, slowly but steadily fueling its decline. After Russia will lose the war in Ukraine, their decline will accelerate due to internal turmoil that will eventually lead to its collapse. History knows many examples when empires fall due to the war they couldn't win, preceded by a period of stagnation. I think with Russia this can happen anywhere between 3 to 70 years. It's very hard to predict because there are a lot of variables on the table, but it's just a question of time. My second argument why Russia is going to collapse will sound crazy at first, but please suspend your judgment until you hear it all. Russia will collapse because it's fake and built on lies. See, things built on lies are not as stable as things built on truth, and this applies to everything. A house, a relationship, a company, a country. While built on lies, a relationship, for example, can survive and even prosper sometimes. But at the same time, it's much more fragile and prone to a breakup, especially when the truth becomes exposed. Like the type of truth that exposed a state-run doping program in Russia. Just let that sink in for a bit. Russia was deliberately doping its athletes and had a system set up on a government level to avoid detection. Sounds crazy, but it's true. Please watch the Oscar-winning documentary Icarus. And this truth is just a tiny fraction out of a deep pit hole of lies. So just how deep is that pit hole? And this is where it gets fuzzy. See, history is written by the winners, and a lie repeated 1,000 times will become the truth. Moscow had a lot of victories and a lot of time to repeat its lies. I think there are cases where we might never find the truth behind a well-established lie. You know about Russia only what they want you to know, and they are masters at hiding the truth and twisting the facts. Remember they tried to hide that Chernobyl ever happened? They had a parade in Kyiv pretending that everything is okay and nothing serious has happened. They only failed to hide Chernobyl because radiation has leaked outside of USSR. But Chernobyl was a second major nuclear disaster that happened in Soviet Union. You might have never ever heard of the first one, the Kyshtym disaster. Heck, Chernobyl disaster didn't even need to happen if the government wouldn't hide the truth about the flaw in the reactor from the engineers running the power station. So, with that established that Russians are masters at hiding truth and twisting facts, I'd like to ask you to consider a following statement, which is, most of Russian history has been deliberately falsified, like the name Russia is stolen from Kievan Rus, entire historical events made up, their inventions and achievements appropriated from others. The very concept of Russian is an artificially constructed one. And how do I know this? Well, for two reasons. One, Russia could not destroy all the historical evidence, in particular the one that is abroad. And two, a history built on lies will inevitably lead to contradictions. To give you a good example of contradiction, Russians are proud to call themselves anti-fascists. They are the ones who helped the world get rid of the Nazis. Heck, they even invaded Ukraine, claiming they want to denazify us. However, they deliberately conceal the fact that they were in alliance with the Nazis until 1941, when Nazis betrayed their alliance and invaded USSR. Russians actually started the Second World War alongside with Hitler by invading Poland in 1939. They even had a joint military parade in Brest-Litovsk. So in a way, anti-fascists in alliance with fascists. What a contradiction. Russians now of course deny any alliance with Hitler, and they don't know about the joint parade. The truth was being hidden from them and was tried to be hidden from the world. We only know about this alliance thanks to German documents that got exposed. Russia has never revealed its secrets from back then, and while Ukraine and other ex-Soviet states have declassified their KGB archives, Russia is still holding on to all of those secrets. So what could potentially be one of those secrets that we don't know? One of them could be how they deliberately created the concept of Russian nationality in the 1930s. They created it with the purpose of assimilating other nations into it as to prevent the empire's collapse by ethnic reasons, like it collapsed in 1917. They needed to create a superior nation that would be the backbone of the empire. And you might ask a reasonable question, but wait a minute, how did Russians call themselves before that? Well, before that they called themselves Velikorossi, and before that they called themselves Muscovites. The actual Russian nationality is artificially made up. Nobody identified themselves as Russian 100 years ago. So the term Russian that they created is actually this one, Ruskiye, which is actually an adjective implying belonging and is directly translated of Russian. Any nationality can belong to this group. That's why we see Stalin, the Georgian, Simonyan, the Armenian, and the Minister of their Offense, Shoigu, an Asian Tuvinian, all call themselves of Russian belonging. Propaganda in the USSR quickly spread the belief that being Russian is superior and first class. Stalin in 1945 made a toast saying, quote, "I drink first of all to the health of the Russian people, because they are the most outstanding nation of all the nations that make up the Soviet Union." Yeah, Ukrainians, Georgians, Belarusians, doesn't matter. Second class. Russians, that's where it's at. Being Russian in the empire? Oh, that's prestigious. This message of Russian superiority was conveyed everywhere. In movies, sports, media. Forced Russification was taking place too. Forced at birth to identify as Russian. In the empire, you'd also struggle to get an education in your native language or couldn't advance in your career if you were not of Russian belonging. And here I have something interesting for you. I'm gonna show you an interview of somebody who was born in Soviet Union, lived in Soviet Union, been a part of Soviet army, and witnessed this Russification happening with their own eyes. That person being my dad. Hi Dad, could you tell me your story about how Ukrainians were converted into Russians? I've heard you say it a long time ago, but can you repeat it again for us, please?
Actually, during my service in Soviet Army, later for police department, I always dealt with many people, especially when I was human resources department, and I met a lot of stories, documentary stories, when people were strongly advised to change their nationality. And some people could not do anything about that because it was made instead of them in childhood. For example, I had a friend, Vladimir Maslik. His parents were Ukrainians from Chernigiv region, but somehow they moved to Russia, to Krasnodar region, and Vladimir was born there. And his parents were told that since he was born in Russia, he was registered as Russian. And a couple more examples.
So, Ukrainians that had a baby in Russia, that baby was already registered as Russian.
Yes, indeed. And it was not their will. They were forced to do that.
They were forced to do
Because
that.
they were told since he was born in Russia, then
Mhm.
he was supposed to become Russian, not Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Many other examples were related with changing their surnames. I had several cases when, for example, guy, his surname was Semirozum originally from the birth. He was advised, strongly advised, to change his surname for Semirozumov, to add just ending ov, and then instead of Ukrainian, there would be Russian surname. And for example, I had a friend, Ruslan Aganesian. He was born in Narofominsk, Moscow region, and originally he was Armenian, but he was registered as Russian. And even my wife, actually, she was registered as Russian, despite the fact that her father was Ukrainian and her mother was Chechen nationality. But instead of being a Chechen or Ukrainian, she was made somehow like Russian.
Right. So, Ukrainian father, Chechen mother, and then all of a sudden, Russian.
Indeed.
Yeah, and this is my mom, your wife. So it's fascinating how Russian is just something like a cult, like a religious cult or something. Here you go, you're now Russian.
You have to remember that was about Soviet Union. Soviet Union was like an empire, but with another name. And so in Soviet Union, Russian people were like the core of the empire, and it was kind of prestigious to be Russian. So some people would like volunteer to become Russians because it would serve for their career. But some people were kind of strongly advised to become Russian instead of Ukrainian, and instead of to be other nationality, because in Soviet Union, if you apply for any position, there was like a lot of jokes about Article number 5. Article number 5 was about nationality, and nationality might spoil everything, all of your expectations, all your career, and that is why many people voluntarily were ready to change their nationality.
Well, thank you very much for this story, personal story. I'm sure you have much more, but I think this would be enough for my video. So thank you again.
You're welcome.
Of Russian nationality is artificially created phenomena. I'd say this is a group of people who speak Russian and are having values of subordinating to a master, of violence, and superiority to other nations. Take one of those away and you cannot identify as Russian anymore. I know it's a strong claim, and strong claims require strong evidences, but unfortunately I don't have time in this episode of Why Russia Will Collapse to present to you all the evidence how Russian nationality was made up. If there will be a comment in this video requesting this topic with over 10 likes, I will guarantee to make it. For now, that you can also check out this video called What Muscovy Really Is, that is also explaining how it stole the name Russia and even fabricated heroic deeds to sound more badass. So for now, everything I've said above should be sufficient enough to validate my argument that Russia is going to collapse because it is fake. And I'm very excited to contribute to this a little bit by exposing the truth, one video at a time. I hope the truth to them is as lethal as the sunlight to a vampire. And you can contribute to Russia's collapse too, by sharing this video and by donating to Ukraine Armed Forces. In the description of this video, I'm gonna leave a PayPal email of a volunteer that I'm not affiliated with, but whom you can trust, and donate at least $1 to help Ukraine defend itself. Argument number 3. Russia is a failed state. This would be my weakest argument why Russia would collapse, but nevertheless, it is certainly a state that is failing and its future is not looking optimistic. You know it's a failed state when its own laws are not upheld. The constitution grants freedom of speech, freedom of gathering, declares Russia as a federal republic, forbids presidency for over 2 terms, etc., etc. But in reality, people get arrested for reading constitution out loud in the street. The so-called private army of Wagner totally violates all possible laws, from illegal weapon carrying, illegal mercenarism, mass illegal amnesty to convicts who committed serious crimes. And by the way, the leader of Chechnya region has a private army too. The Minister of Defense and the head of Crimea have a private army as well. The Russian government doesn't have a monopoly on violence anymore. Feels like Russia is slowly turning into a feudal state. You also know that it is a failing state when it is the richest country on earth in terms of natural resources, but 20 million people live for less than $150 a month. Such a state is clearly failing in providing well-being to its citizens in many ways. From education, where more and more schools are closing each year, to healthcare. A lot of Russian hospitals look like this. Outdated buildings, no decent bathrooms, cockroaches, and of course, complete lack of modern medical equipment. Sacked with corruption, this state is failing with each year more and more. You also know it's a failed state when it does not honor its international agreements. When annexing Crimea, it broke 3 international agreements, and when invading Ukraine, it broke several articles of international law, on top of committing mass war crimes, basically being like terrorists. You simply cannot trust Russia to uphold its word. Any agreement with them is not worth the paper it's written on. And this was said 200 years ago. And since then, nothing has changed. You know it's a failed state when it uses its army covertly, ripping off the insignia and covering its soldiers behind masks. It's a failing state when it's using an athlete doping program on a government level. It's a failing state when it puts in jail people who expose the truth and problems within the system. It's a failing state when an ambulance gets stuck in the mud because there are no roads. It's a failing state when a man who killed an infant gets only 1.5 years in jail, while a man who condemned the war got sentenced for 7 years. Just let that sink in for a moment. The fourth final argument why Russia will collapse is actually more of a moral one. Russia should not exist in its current borders because it has brought too much pain, suffering and terror, and not just to Ukrainians or Georgians or Syrians or Chechens or Moldovans, but to humanity overall, and people living in this very Russia in the first hand. People living there probably suffered the most, majority of them experiencing very low standards of living with no freedoms, most trying to leave Russia as soon as they get a chance, and others who have no chance to leave are brainwashed to believe in their own exaggerated grandeur, believing that British people are eating squirrels because of hunger. But what's most important here is that by invading Ukraine, Russia has proved that it just cannot change. It cannot be different, it cannot be democratic. This is the way it is now, this is the way it has always been, and this is the way it will be. Anti-freedom, anti-human rights, anti-democracy, racist, sexist, homophobic, militaristic, built on lies, and incapable of being human rights-centric. They have no honor or dignity. They hide their insignia. They act covertly. They break agreements. They cheat in sports. They spend billions of dollars to spread lies. In Russia, human life is devalued. From a child dying by falling into a pothole that government couldn't even bother to cover, to a tactic of Zerg suicidal attacks on a fortified Ukrainian positions. Needless to say, if they don't value their own lives, you can imagine the amount of atrocities they commit to others. Russians captured a video cutting off the head of Ukrainian POW while he screams it hurts. They recorded cutting off testicles of Ukrainian prisoner of war with the words "Ukrainians should not multiply." They recorded execution of Ukrainian POW after he said "Glory to Ukraine." They have human heads on sticks like it's medieval time. They hold human skulls as a trophy. Tortures and humiliations is a staple for Russians, as reported by thousands of survivors. In region of Russia, Chechnya, Ukrainian prisoners of war were gifted to its leader like it was some kind of gift, as if it's an ancient Rome and slavery is back in order. On occupied territory, a woman was tied to a pole just for having pro-Ukrainian views. And these are not individual cases. This is the essence of what being Russian is. I'll give you an example. Roman Asechkin has exposed 40 gigabytes of footage from Russian prison exposing tortures. Horrific tortures. You know what happened to Roman? A criminal case was initiated against him. Exposing problems in Russia will lead you to jail. Little town of Bucha has become anonymous with Russian atrocities. They would tie the hands behind the back, torture, and shoot the residents in the rear of their head. They would use civilians as target practice. They would lock 30 people in the basement with no food or water like they did in the village of Yahidne. Russians deliberately and openly bomb Ukrainian power plants so that people in Ukraine would suffer with no heat or water in the freezing wintertime, which is actually one-to-one tactic of what Hitler was doing in World War II by bombing Britain with V-2 rockets. Those bombings have the same goals: to kill as many people and to spread as much suffering and terror so that people would lose the will to fight. It's not a coincidence that both Nazis and Russists call their attacks as vengeance strikes. And both were losing the war at that point. And both have failed to achieve the desired outcome. Nazis have fired over 3,000 rockets on Britain, while Russists have fired over 5,000 rockets onto Ukraine. Russia has been committing war crimes in Syria and is committing war crimes in Ukraine daily. Estimated 600 people killed with aviabomb in the theater with huge word children outside. Murdered at least 58 civilians preparing to evacuate on a train station in Kramatorsk. Bombed a shopping mall in Kremenchuk, killing 21 people. Bombed a center of Vinnytsia, killing 24 people. Bombed apartment buildings in countless cities of Ukraine, Dnipro, Kiev, Uman, Odessa, etc. In my hometown, Chernihiv, with one airstrike, Russians killed 47 people, most of which were in the line to the pharmacy. My city by that time was under Russian blockade. My own apartment was just a block away from that attack and windows shattered everywhere. And there were no military targets in the area, as there were no military targets in any of the examples and other war crimes that Russians have committed. On a side note, I have a theory that this is why Russians are losing, because they're wasting resources killing civilians. So while Russia commits those terrorist attacks and crystallize into a fascist state, we don't see mass protests in Russia against the war, protests massive enough that could have overwhelmed the police. No, we don't see that. Nor we don't see Russians abroad protesting for the regime change, like we see the Iranians protesting in Berlin or Los Angeles. And why would that be? That's because majority of Russians either approve of the war or just plain don't care. In which case, apathy to this horror, I think, is arguably even a worse position to be at. I'll give you another chilling example of Russian behavior. After each vengeance strike, Russians on social media rejoice how Ukrainians suffer, rejoice the more Ukrainians die. And those are not bots, those are real people. I lack words to describe it. To hit the final nail on the coffin, I'll just show you a little compilation of what Russians say themselves. And maybe you'll agree with me that such a state should cease existing in its current borders, for the sake of all humanity.
Поэтому, наверное, надо проводить там тоже, да?
Там надо их всех хохлов до последнего и детей. Это гниль, ее надо.
Все население?
Все население.
А Польша куда, присоединить к России?
Ее тоже. А украинцев всех, вплоть до младенцев, всех уничтожить. Эта гниль, она распространилась, она уже... Теперь нас не любят они.
Russia today is a terrorist state worse than ISIS, operating in medieval inhuman values. Russia proved it cannot change, and as long as it exists, it will be breeding wars and terror. It will be opposing democracies and freedoms. And it doesn't matter what Muscovy calls itself. Russian Empire, Muscovy Tsardom, USSR, or Russian Federation. It must and will cease existing in its current borders. I think ideally it should collapse into dozens of independent nations that Muscovy has captured, enslaved over the course of many centuries. Perhaps you've heard about that little nation, Chechnya, who tried to secede from Russian Empire in the 90s. In return, Muscovites, while being at the peak of their freedoms, at the peak of their democracies, have drowned this territory in blood. They wiped its capital, Grozny, like they wiped Mariupol. But before that, Chechnya, just for a brief period, was independent, and it had its own leader, Johar Dudayev, a man who gave his life fighting for the freedom of his people, fighting to be free from Muscovy's grip. At the end of this long video, I would like to thank you for watching until the very end. I would like to ask you to subscribe and to share this video, and I would like to present to you a quote of Johar Dudayev that he said in 1995. There is not a single ideology in the world, even in theory, acting more cruelly and cynically than Russianism. They have no moral principles. They are all like animals. The Western countries, the world community, must completely isolate Russia and destroy it as a state, so that this bloodthirsty beast would cease existing on Earth. This bloodthirsty beast would cease existing on Earth. Johar Dudayev, 1995.